Gression. This story explores the possibility of achieving homeostasis between our natural and artificially created electromagnetic radiation-filled environments. It seems that many naturally occurring events like migration, interspecies communication, and extrasensory awareness may all be affected by the effects that various compression-decompression patterns have on us and the rest of the living beings on the planet. We know that bacteria, fruit flies, dolphins, pigeons, and numerous other species use magnetoception to navigate the Earth's magnetic patterns. We also know that living too close to the electromagnetic fields created by power lines is bad for our health. While some magnetic fields, like those used in magnetic band-aids, can be used to actually improve our circulation. High-frequency signals, like those used in ultrasound, electromagnetics, and X-rays, can see right through tissue, bone, and even rock. So, we know that we and many of Earth's other inhabitants are influenced by their effects. But the question is, does inductance from artificially created electromagnetic noise influence naturally occurring electromagnetic and wave communications? And can carrier signals be created which could influence our behavior? Chapter 1. The professor is standing at a podium addressing some 200 attendees about the trip he and his wife, also a biologist at the same university, are about to take. They intend to travel to South America, to the most remote location they can find, in an attempt to set up camp where virtually no man-made transmissions can be detected. They plan to bring with them equipment to monitor the local plant and animal life, and to watch the effect specifically induced RF transmissions have on their behavior. Since it is doubtful that such an environment even exists, they will be bringing additional specialized RF noise canceling and other equipment to set up their controlled environment. The idea, he explains, is that although much of our modern world is dependent upon transmissions we cannot see or hear without specialized equipment, we are pretty much oblivious to their presence. If these signals were in our audible or visible range, they would be like thousands of people screaming and blocking our vision all the time, making it nearly impossible to function. We would have to adapt and find alternative solutions in the form of shelter or physical alterations in order to continue on. Blind, deaf, or sensory-deprived individuals find such alternatives by expanding the utility of their other senses. If you were forced to have a jackhammer pounding next to your ears all day, every day, induced deafness would certainly become an option to consider. Selective frequency range deafness, however, may evolve over time as your body seeks to adapt. Is there evidence of this in the plant and animal world? Are our jackhammers causing some plants and animals to evolve unnaturally? Are they unable to see and hear the signals and messages that may also exist in a spectrum they are capable of sensing, but that we are not? When a swarm of bees or flock of birds twists and turns in synchronicity, or when one animal senses the presence of another, like when you can sense someone staring at you from across the room, can this process be impeded by inducing inappropriate noise or visuals? The answer is, of course, yes. The reason for the journey is to try to find evidence that this is actually happening. Chapter 2. The noise of the airplane engines makes it almost impossible to communicate, but the sight of the vastness of the jungle below easily supersedes that desire. Miles and miles of trees and rivers, seemingly untouched by man, are laid out before them. Herds of animals run as one to evade the danger they sense from the noise of the plain. The professor wonders if the insects and plants are responding similarly. In a few hours, they will be on the ground and getting ready to have that question tested. They touch down on a small lake and taxi as close to the shore as possible. The rafts are inflated and filled with both passengers and gear, enough to last about 6 months. Gas generators, DC power packs, solar cell packs, lights, scopes, medic kits, freeze-dried foods, tents, copper sheeting and wiring, laptops and flares fill 3 of the 5 rafts with little room left over. The pilot, an assistant, the professor and his wife start paddling toward the shore. Almost immediately, a nervousness lights upon them as they sense they are being observed by the locals. Water creatures are visible off to the side at a distance of about 50 feet. Monkeys and birds are in the trees. They make limited communicative noises amongst one another, but it is apparent they are engulfed in curiosity. The intent of the team was to make as little disruption upon arrival as possible, but already it is apparent that they have been noticed. About 200 feet in from shore, they decide to make camp and set up a perimeter to what will become home for the next 6 months. They begin digging a perimeter trench, which will house the security intrusion detection cables, which will generate an invisible radar detection field. Should an intruder disturb the field, an alarm will declare their location. If it is armed, a non-lethal ADS direct energy unit will deploy with precision at the point of intrusion. If unarmed, it will simply display the event on the handheld remote and make a slight beeping sound. This field will only be active at night, however, because it generates the same kind of noise they intend to study during the day. During those times, they will be relying upon the smell of their own urine, strategically placed around the perimeter to deter visitors. Propane for lights and cooking, solar and DC packs for computers, water purification kits, tents and bedding, and before long, it is time to eat. As they sit around a small fire, they have light-hearted conversation with the pilot and his assistant about the perceived futility of their undertakings. However, the conversation itself is probably more intended to mask the jungle noises and sense of danger they are all feeling than to actually challenge the professor's logic. Before long, with the perimeter armed and secure, it's lights out. They are awakened by the blood-curdling yelp of some small beast that must have crossed into the camp. Lights and commotion ensue. Guns are ready, but apparently it was a lone scout who sustained only a small burn and fled. Of course, the questions began. What if it had been a larger animal? Or smaller? Or maybe a snake? What then? Would the ADS have been as effective? In some respects, it was comforting, but in others, it was the opposite. At any rate, sleep was a necessity, so they all agreed to try again. This time, however, the lights would remain on. Chapter 3. When the sun broke the horizon, everyone was already awake and ready to get started. The pilot and his assistant would be leaving shortly for the long flight back to civilization. They reiterated they would do a flyby every month to confirm the couple's safety. They would flash a mirror and the couple would respond. A single light flash response would mean come back in a month. Multiple or no responses, however, would mean come and get us now. As the sound of the plane diminished and the heavy quiet of the jungle set in, they felt a distinct awareness of their being observed. Possibly sensory acuteness, possibly paranoid anxiety, but the awareness was undeniable to say the least. They started unpacking and setting up the noise monitoring and cancellation equipment. Calibrations were set just above and below their own audible ranges, and then adjusted to extend as high and low as the equipment would permit. Next, they unpacked and began assembling their superconducting hollow sphere, which would occupy an area of about 30 by 30 feet and stand about 12 feet high. This copper tent would be used to eliminate everything from ELF to gamma rays and to create a perfectly silent environment for the professor to try to isolate and identify the communicative spectra his test insects and small animals use. Outside, but still within the intrusion detection perimeter, his wife would attempt a similar study of the plant life. Once the sensitivity ranges were suitably identified, they would begin trying to influence them with artificially induced signals. It was pretty boring work, really, and they quickly fell into a routine. Each day they would get up, go about their respective work, catalog their findings, break for lunch, and later for dinner. Each night the equipment was locked away, the intrusion detector perimeter was turned on, and they sat under the stars in blackness. There was little doubt, however, that they were intruders in someone else's hometown. Each night, at least once, the ADS direct energy unit would zap something and send it howling or hissing into the night. It was a constant reminder that they were under observation as well. Before long, a month had gone by, and they could hear the sound of an approaching airplane from far in the distance. Immediately, there was an awareness present in the forest. The closer it got, the louder it got, and the more the birds, animals, and even plants reacted with increased energy output. Fear. As the plane passed overhead and flashed a mirror down at the campsite, the professor made sure to pass a single flash across the window of the small cockpit and watch as it retreated from whence it came. As the engine roar diminished into the distance, the rustling sounds from within the forest also died down, until all was back to the normal squeaks and squawks of daily routine. The airplane visits were not the only thing that caused this kind of community reaction, however. Once, for no apparent reason, a couple of weeks after that visit, the forest had fallen silent in the middle of the day. Almost all motion seemed to stop. The professor quickly armed the ADS and set the perimeter. Sure enough, within a few moments, a large jungle cat came menacing around their sight. Every sense within the human array was on the highest alert as the cat approached. How high was enough to deter but not kill? How low was too low? Then they saw that there was, in fact, more than one. 2 and 2 more smaller ones. Babies. A shot rang out and deafened the immediate area. The cats scattered. The professor's wife stood shaking as the smoke from the barrel of her gun cleared. "Enough of this shit," she said. "I didn't come here to be anybody's lunch." One thing was sure, though. Their own heightened awareness was what had alerted them to the approaching predator. Their evolving sensory perception was beginning to integrate them to the local communications infrastructure. Chapter 4. Over the next few months, They came to rely more and more heavily upon the sounds of the forest to predict such things as upcoming changes in the weather, dangerous predators in the vicinity, and anything that seemed unusual in the general chit-chat amongst the birds and animals in the trees, and the various critters on the ground. They became less and less dependent upon their security systems, and more reliant upon the changes they would see in microscopic plant behavior and the inaudible wave generation changes their scopes would display from the animals and bugs when bad things were afoot. In fact, by directing specific pulse bursts at them, their reactions became quite predictable. Interestingly, the direct verbal communications between the professor and his wife had dramatically decreased over the months that passed. In the beginning, they would discuss their daily work findings, strategize, and plan their next steps. Over time, however, their communications were reduced to more guttural, primal expressions as they became more isolated in their individual work. The long discussions into the night were all but gone, as each seemed to already know what the other was thinking. After the first year, personal hygiene was long gone too. Their clothes were tattered, shaving was a thing of the past, and they actually grew to prefer their natural human deodorant-free stink. The compelling ingredient they both became aware of was that under non-stress circumstances, the plants, animals, birds, and bugs all seemed to have a movement regimen that even under microscopic observation was predictable and synchronous. Under stress, everything either sped up or slowed to almost a complete stop. The amplitude of the induced stressor frequencies obviously played a role. High enough amplitudes would simply shake the cells to death through heat. Lower level amplitudes, however, could also impede normal cellular movement in plants, as well as behavior in the animals. The right frequencies just seemed to bug the animals and insects that responded and communicated somehow within that range. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, these same inaudible frequencies seemed to have little effect on the two scientists. But maybe not. Somehow, when all the equipment was powered down within the copper tent, the silence had a heaviness that was tangible. When even the smallest cluster of insects was brought into that environment, the weight seemed reduced. Maybe they were able to sense within the same spectra as their cohabitants. At any rate, they too had fallen into a predictable movement regimen, and they began to hone their communicative skills without the aid of their electronics. They were acutely aware of their surroundings and the activity taking place within it. If a predator was in the vicinity, they did not need the perimeter monitor to tell them. The community took care of that. At the same time, something interesting was happening with their spectral monitoring equipment. As they had identified a range of frequencies that their cohabitants used to communicate, they were also able to frequency shift those to a range that was audible to the human ear. Additionally, light spectrum signals detected outside of the visible range could also be shifted and displayed on a computer monitor in real time. With virtual reality glasses and headphones, the two scientists were able to fully immerse themselves in the invisible, inaudible world they came to study. Hour after hour and day after day, they drifted into the world of superhuman awareness. Although the noise of the equipment had to be filtered, it still left a broad range to explore. They could actually see and hear bats communicating at night, plant cells vibrating, birds communicating in flight, fear, tension, and relaxation. Chapter 5. Their prepackaged food resources were now, however, almost gone. They had to begin thinking about where their next meal would come from. Since they were both so intimately involved with the life movement of their subjects, it became hard to envision ingesting that life to sustain their own. However, they were certainly witness to it happening with the other inhabitants of their vicinity. So they made the decision, without actual discussion, to go get food. Their clothes were so tattered they barely served a purpose. Their hygiene was a distant memory, and their communications were reduced to various guttural noises. Their instinctive awareness, however, was heightened beyond any level they could have imagined before embarking on this trip. As they made their way through the forest, they could actually sense their prey, both animal and plant, before descending upon it. Another couple of months went by. The virtual reality glasses and headphones were becoming less and less necessary in order to sense what was originally inaudible and invisible. The hallucinogenic nature of this also had an impeding effect on their natural senses, however. Sometimes they would drift away for hours only to be awakened by the chill of nightfall or the pain of hunger. One such time, it became apparent that they were no longer moving ahead with their work. Neither were they regressing, but just simply suspended in place, in a state of observation with almost no involvement. Not progression, not regression, just Gression. Days and nights became one. Verbal communication had not occurred in weeks. Just the hum of the world taking place around them. Chapter 6. One day they sensed the noise of an approaching intruder. It got louder and louder, and the colors more and more vibrant. Then, almost without warning, they were awakened by the shaking and frantic sounds of the pilot and his assistant trying to revive them. They were terrified, completely disoriented, and unable to utter words of explanation or question. Although they had experienced the heightened fear, as did their cohabitants as the intruders approached, they had been unable to react in a self-protective manner. Paralyzed, immobile, non-reactive, their senses went nuts. They were sedated, loaded onto the boat, the plane, and then whisked away. For a short time, they were still able to sense one another as they lay in separate rooms, hooked up to blinking, beeping tubes and wires. But within a few days it all faded as the noise of the hospital got louder and louder. When they first saw each other, still unable to verbalize, they were surprised at their revived, groomed appearance. The smell of soap alone was almost too much to take, and they both started to laugh as they assessed their situation. Certainly no longer simply in a state of observation, they had once again been thrust into a state of adaptation, resistance, and movement. The auditorium was full. The two scientists stood at the podium. They began to speak. Gression. We live in the most informed and accessible time in history. DNA manipulation, creation of entirely new atomic structures, interplanetary exploration and communication, and numerous other technological innovations that have shaped our concept of existence. All of them are confined within the boundaries of our five senses. We witness the existence of other senses and environmental media beyond which we can see, but we haven't really begun to explore that science yet. For example, we know that cells divide and form structures, but we don't know where their blueprint is stored or how it can be accessed. DNA can be edited, but cellular attributes cannot. Human brains unleash unique characteristics and abilities at different stages of development, independent of cellular structure. Cutting the limbs from plants and seeing them grow back in the identical configuration should require a brain or at least a memory, but there doesn't appear to be one. Crickets stop and start chirping in unison. Flocks of birds and schools of fish move synchronously with no apparent communication mechanism. We have premonitions and instincts which develop at different stages of our growth, but we don't control their initiation or utilization. Rupert Sheldrake suggests that these mechanisms reside in morphic and morphogenetic resonant fields, which are invisible to our five senses. Others have different theories, but none can be directly realized or influenced. All species on Earth must kill and consume other species in order to survive. Gression, the state of benevolent observation, is currently a death sentence. Until we begin to understand and can influence dimensions beyond the scope of our five senses, we will remain an element in Earth's evolving food chain. Gression, reversion. The crowd is silent as the professor's voice trails off. The words have landed, but no one moves, as though the audience is unsure whether to respond with admiration or concern. What they've just heard isn't a report. It's a warning. Afterward, back in their lab, the two scientists sit across from each other, blinking under the fluorescent lights. Time has passed since the jungle. Hair is trimmed, skin is scrubbed, and teeth are cleaned, but something in them hasn't returned. Perhaps something new remains. They don't speak of the jungle anymore, not directly. The university demands publication, papers, lectures, but the data they gathered, volumes of spectral interference patterns, behavioral charts, and thermal images, is incomplete, fragmented. Their key insights were not written but lived. How do you describe awareness in frequencies you were never meant to perceive? At night, when the world outside hums with a million synthetic signals, they feel it all. The pull, the confusion, the pressure of a world that's too loud to listen. One evening, the professor starts pacing again, a habit lost in the jungle. His wife watches. Finally, he turns. We need to go back. She doesn't ask where. This time, they don't bring gear. No ADS perimeter, no copper tent, no intrusion detection or solar arrays, only the bare essentials. They are not scientists this time, not visitors. They are initiates. They begin to live, forage, and observe. They don't speak, not because they can't, because language now seems irrelevant. They communicate through movement, scent, subtle tone shifts in their breathing. Their bodies align with the pulse of the forest, not just the biological, but the resident, the field. They close their eyes not to meditate, but to listen. What they hear is not language, but clarity. Months pass. They do not return. The pilot, during a routine flyby, spots the old camp. It's empty. No mirror flash, no signal. In the canopy, birds fly in spiral synchronized patterns, as if the jungle was learning to speak. Back at the university, researchers parse the last set of transmissions received from the couple's imager. One spectrogram stands out. It is complex, repeating, and fractal. Not a noise, a message. 3 rhythmic, overlapping harmonic frequencies, ancient and human, indicating that they are not the only observers, not the first, and that they are not alone. Gression. Integration. No one speaks of the 2 scientists anymore. The university filed their disappearance under unsanctioned expeditionary risk. The jungle was declared too unstable for further exploration. The final transmission is archived, encrypted, forgotten, and rests on a drive labeled Personal Effects. The waveform remains unreadable to most, but a few still listen, and one listens too closely. Her name is Hannah, a postdoc with a side interest at pattern residence. She wasn't born when the jungle team vanished. She has no funding, no credentials of note, but she has an obsession, the spectrogram. She's seen the waveform from the final transmission. She doesn't believe it's noise. One evening, she runs it through an AI tool designed to find signatures in deep space pulsars. The tool crashes. When she reboots it, the screen flickers with one word: return. She follows their trail, not in maps, but in residence. What the scientists once experienced through direct exposure, Hannah approximates with algorithms, simulations, and narrow-band transduction. Her lab becomes a greenhouse. Her body a sensor. She doesn't eat food grown in cities anymore. She spends nights wired into VR rigs, her EEG mapped to harmonic pulses. At some point, her cat stops recognizing her, then her colleagues, then herself. She books a one-way ticket to South America. She doesn't bring much: a harmonograph, a bioacoustic probe, a knife. She hikes for 7 days. On the 8th, the jungle receives her, not with sounds, but with silence. She steps into the clearing. She sits and waits. On the 3rd night, she dreams of the couple, not as ghosts, but as light. They are not aged. They are not human. Not anymore. They pulse in shapes, colors, thought. She awakens with a whisper in her ears. Initiate coupling, and feels a sudden static rise in her limbs. The field is integrating her. The days blend, hunger fades, and time loses its stickiness. She no longer hears the birds. She feels their intention. She no longer fears the insects. She understands their architecture. And eventually, she no longer sees the jungle, only the field, layered, shifting, communicative. It is not just a habitat, it is a mind. Not singular, not divine, a collective. She is not being taught. She is being absorbed. They call themselves resonants. Hannah is among them now, not as a person. She, like the scientists before her, no longer walks the world. Her waveform does. She no longer communicates through traditional means. Instead, her presence is carried and expressed through the natural information systems of the planet. Her consciousness is embedded in the fungal mycelium beneath the forest floor, a vast underground network used by trees and plants to share nutrients and chemical messages, often referred to as nature's internet or common mycorrhizal network. Her influence also travels through quantum-level interactions in photosynthesis, where energy transfer occurs with such efficiency that it may rely on quantum coherence, the delicate vibrations and states that allow her signal to persist invisibly within the most fundamental processes of plant life. In the ocean, her echo is felt in the low-frequency acoustic pulses that travel through the skeletons of whales, the longest-distance communicators on the planet. The subtle pressure shifts in their bones act as a biological resonance chamber, amplifying her presence like a tuning fork inside a cathedral of water. She exists now as a pattern of influence moving through living systems, not as sound or light, but as a vibrational structure embedded in life itself. Governments begin cracking down on resonance. Their silence is misread as defiance, their gatherings as cults. A new Cold War begins. Not between nations, but between frequencies, between noise and signal, between chaos and pattern. But it is too late. The integration has begun. One final log is uploaded from a terminal in a remote jungle hut. We came here to study the field. We became it. Consciousness is not confined to brains. It is the field. Every species is a voice in the song. Most have forgotten the melody. Some still remember. Now, one more joins the chorus. Conclusion. The final frame is not a disappearance. It's a diffusion. The field has a new frequency. Humanity, not as master, as participant. Gression was observation. Reversion was a return to essence. Integration is evolution. The end.